There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a girl who has been told in 1,000 small ways that she does not exist. It is not the silence of peace, but the silence of a library no one bothers to open. For 3 seasons, Penelope Fairweather was that library, a collection of clever thoughts and sharp observations bound in the unfortunate shade of lemon yellow. But as the saying goes, the most dangerous thing in London is not a highwayman with a pistol, but a woman who has finally realized she has nothing left to lose. If you believe a wallflower deserves her day in the sun, subscribe and tell us in the comments which historical era would you choose for your own grand scandal. Chapter 1. The Wilted Primrose. The air in the Bridgerton Blue Ballroom was thick with the scent of beeswax, expensive perfumes, and the stifling musk of desperation.
"Marry Penelope?" Percy's voice was loud, buoyed by too much brandy and the safety of a room full of men. "Good God, Alfred, one might as well marry a piece of the wainscoting. She is perfectly harmless, I suppose, but marrying her would be like wedded bliss with a particularly quiet housecat. One forgets she's in the room until she trips over your feet. I require a wife with a bit of spirit, or at least a face one remembers 5 minutes after looking at it." The laughter that followed was sharp, like breaking glass. Penelope did not drop her drink. She did not gasp. She did not even flush. Instead, a strange, cold clarity washed over her. It was the sensation of a fever breaking. For 3 years she had tried to be safe. She had tried to be the girl who did not offend, the girl who smiled politely while her soul withered under the weight of 1,000 ignored dances. A quiet housecat, she thought. How very droll. She set her lemonade down on a passing tray with a hand that was perfectly steady. She did not look back at the alcove. She did not need to. She already knew that Lord Percy was a fool, but what stung was her own complicity in his assessment. She had allowed them to see her as a shadow. She walked out of the ballroom, through the grand foyer and straight to her carriage, ignoring her mother's shrill calls from the top of the stairs. The next morning, Penelope did not head to Hyde Park for a dismal stroll. Instead, she directed her driver to a small, discreet shop on Bond Street, the kind of place where the silks cost more than a small country estate, and the modist, Madame Vionnet, looked at débutantes as if they were unfinished sketches in need of a violent erasure.
"I want a new wardrobe," Penelope said, stepping into the centre of the plush fitting room. Madame Vionnet swept a disparaging eye over Penelope's muslin day dress. "The yellow is unfortunate, mademoiselle. Perhaps a soft pink?" "No," Penelope said, her voice dropping an octave. It was the voice of a woman who had just burned her bridges and was enjoying the warmth of the fire. "I want emerald green. I want the colour of midnight ink, and I want a gown the colour of a blood-red rose, the kind of red that makes people think of scandals and revolution." The modiste paused, her measuring tape hovering in mid-air. She looked at Penelope, really looked at her, noticing for the first time the sharp intelligence in her hazel eyes and the stubborn set of her jaw. A slow, predatory smile spread across the Frenchwoman's face. "Ah," Vionnet whispered, "the mouse has found her teeth." "I do not want to be pretty, madame," Penelope said, watching her reflection in the triptych mirror. "I want to be inevitable. I want every man who looked past me to realize that when they finally look at me, it will be because I am the only thing in the room worth seeing. And then I want to watch them realize they can never have me." By the time she left the shop, the wilted primrose was dead. In her place was something far more dangerous, a woman with a plan, a sharp tongue, and a very long list of names. She did not just want a husband, she wanted a reckoning. Chapter 2. The Devil in the Details. The residence of Silas Thorne, the Viscount Thorne, was exactly like the man himself, imposing, shrouded in shadows, and utterly indifferent to the comfort of others. It was a house of cold marble and dark oak, situated in a corner of Mayfair that seemed to repel the morning sun. Penelope stood before the towering mahogany front door, her breath hitching only was, before she hammered the brass knocker. She was wearing her new midnight ink carriage dress. It was the colour of a bruise just before it fades, a deep, devouring purple that made her skin look like cream and her hair like spun copper. When the butler opened the door, he did not look through her as he usually did. He blinked, his eyes widening at the sheer audacity of an unchaperoned lady standing on the threshold of London's most notorious misanthrope. "I am here to see the Viscount," Penelope said, not waiting for an invitation. She swept past him into the foyer. "Tell him it concerns the Duke of Cumberland and a certain missing ledger. He will know what it means." 5 minutes later, she was ushered into the library. The room smelled of old parchment, expensive tobacco, and something sharper, something like the ozone before a storm. Silas Thorne sat behind a massive desk, a glass of amber liquid at his elbow. He did not rise. He simply watched her approach, his dark eyes hooded, his face a mask of aristocratic boredom. "Miss Fairweather," he drawled, the sound like velvet dragged over gravel. "I had heard you were the sort of girl who blended into the wallpaper. My wallpaper is quite expensive. I should hate for you to get lost in it." "The wallpaper is hideous, my lord," Penelope replied, standing her ground, "and I am finished with blending."
Silas leaned back, a flicker of interest crossing his features. "The ledger you mentioned, it belongs to Lord Sterling, my most tedious political rival. How did a girl who spends her nights standing by the punch bowl come to know of its existence?" "Because people talk in front of furniture, my lord. They assume a wallflower has no ears, just as they assume a shadow has no soul. I know where the ledger is, and I know who he paid to make it disappear. I will give you the names, the dates, and the location." Silas tilted his head. "And what does a housecat want in exchange for such a prize? Milk? A bowl of yarn?" Penelope flinched at the echo of Lord Percy's insult, but she did not waver. "I want you to teach me how to ruin them, all of them. I want to know how you command a room without saying a word. I want to know how to make a man look at me and see his own undoing. I want you to turn me into a predator." A heavy silence descended. Silas rose slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the desk. He walked around the perimeter, circling her like a wolf inspecting a strange new creature that had wandered into its den. "You want to hunt," he whispered, stopping so close she could feel the heat radiating from his waistcoat. "But you do not even know how to stand. You hold yourself as though you are apologizing for occupying space." He reached out, the tip of a long, elegant finger tilting her chin up. His touch was cold, yet it sent a jolt of electricity straight to her spine. "Very well, Penelope. I am bored, and the thought of the Ton's quietest girl tearing the throat out of the social season is intriguing. We begin now." Silas leaned back, a flicker of interest crossing his features. "The ledger you mentioned, it belongs to Lord Sterling, my most tedious political rival. How did a girl who spends her nights standing by the punch bowl come to know of its existence?" "Because people talk in front of furniture, my lord. They assume a wallflower has no ears, just as they assume a shadow has no soul. I know where the ledger is, and I know who he paid to make it disappear. I will give you the names, the dates, and the location." Silas tilted his head. "And what does a housecat want in exchange for such a prize? Milk? A bowl of yarn?" Penelope flinched at the echo of Lord Percy's insult, but she did not waver. "I want you to teach me how to ruin them, all of them. I want to know how you command a room without saying a word. I want to know how to make a man look at me and see his own undoing. I want you to turn me into a predator." A heavy silence descended. Silas rose slowly, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the desk. He walked around the perimeter, circling her like a wolf inspecting a strange new creature that had wandered into its den. "You want to hunt," he whispered, stopping so close she could feel the heat radiating from his waistcoat. "But you do not even know how to stand. You hold yourself as though you are apologizing for occupying space." He reached out, the tip of a long, elegant finger tilting her chin up. His touch was cold, yet it sent a jolt of electricity straight to her spine. "Very well, Penelope. I am bored, and the thought of the Ton's quietest girl tearing the throat out of the social season is intriguing. We begin now."
By the time the grandfather clock struck midnight, Penelope's nerves were frayed, but her spirit was soaring. She looked at Silas, who was watching her from the shadows of a wing-back chair. "Am I a housecat now, my lord?" she asked, her voice laced with a new, sharp confidence. Silas looked at her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, the flint in his eyes seemed to soften, replaced by something dark and hungry. "No, Penelope," he said softly. "You are a disaster waiting to happen, and I cannot wait to see who you destroy first." Chapter 3. The Physics of Yearning. The library was a cavern of silence, save for the rhythmic, heavy thrum-tock of the mahogany grandfather clock in the corner. It was a sound that usually suggested the steady passage of time, but tonight it felt like a countdown. Rain lashed against the tall windows of Thorne House, blurring the lights of London into smears of gold and grey, trapping Penelope and Silas in a world that existed only within these four walls. "A ball is not merely a dance, Penelope," Silas said, cutting through the gloom. He stood by the fireplace, the orange glow of the embers tracing the harsh, handsome line of his profile. "It is a battlefield disguised as a celebration. You must know how to move through the fray while keeping your eyes on the prize." He turned to her, his expression uncharacteristically grave. "Tonight you learn the waltz, not the clumsy stepping you did in your first season, but the version that makes a man forget his own name." Penelope smoothed the skirts of her emerald green silk gown. "I know the steps, my lord. I have spent 3 years watching them from the perimeter." "Knowing the steps is mathematics," Silas countered, walking toward her with a predatory grace. "Feeling the dance is alchemy. There is no music tonight. You must find the rhythm in the air. You must find it in me." He did not wait for her consent. He stepped into her space, the sheer heat of him causing the air to crackle. He placed one hand firmly at the small of her back, not the polite, hovering touch of a gentleman, but a grounding, possessive weight that drew her flush against him. His other hand took hers, his fingers sliding between her own with a familiarity that made her breath hitch. "1, 2, 3, he whispered, his voice vibrating against her temple as he began to move. They spun. Without the distraction of violins or the chatter of the ton, the intimacy was staggering. Penelope could hear the sly of her silk skirts against his wool trousers. She could smell the faint, intoxicating scent of sandalwood and expensive scotch that clung to him. Most of all, she could feel the rhythm of his breathing, low, steady, and increasingly ragged. As they moved through the labyrinth of bookshelves, the lesson began to dissolve. Silas's hand at her waist tightened, drawing her closer until there was not a whisper of space between them. Penelope looked up, her gaze caught in the gravity of his. She saw the way his eyes darkened, the way the flinty grey turned to the colour of a stormy sea. "You are doing it," he murmured, his thumb tracing a slow, agonizing circle against her spine. The 3-second gaze. "But you have forgotten the third step, Penelope. You have not looked away." "Perhaps I do not want to," she whispered, her heart thundering so loudly she was certain he could feel it through her bodice. They came to a halt in the deepest shadows of the library, the momentum of the dance leaving them swaying slightly. Silas did not let go. His gaze searched hers, moving over her brow, the curve of her cheek, and finally settling on her mouth with a hunger that stole the air from her lungs. In that moment, Silas realized with a jolt of alarm that he had made a catastrophic error. He had intended to sharpen a weapon, to mould a wallflower into a diamond he could use for his own political ends. But as he looked at Penelope, really looked at her, he realized she was not just a collection of clever retorts and striking gowns. She was a locked library of a woman,
full of brilliance and fire, and he was the first man who had ever bothered to look for the key. The wit he had found so amusing was now a tether, pulling him toward her with a force he could not fight. He found himself fascinated by the way her mind worked, the way she could dissect a room with a single sentence. She was his equal in a world of shadows, and the realization was terrifying. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy with everything they were not saying. The air seemed to thrum with the physics of yearning, that invisible tension that pulls two bodies together until the cost of staying apart becomes unbearable. Silas leaned in, his forehead brushing hers. Penelope closed her eyes, her lips parting in an unspoken invitation. The grandfather clock chimed the hour, a sharp metallic ring that shattered the spell. Silas recoiled as if burned, his hands dropping to his sides. He turned his back to her, gripping the edge of a bookshelf so hard his knuckles turned white. "That is enough for tonight," he said, his voice sounding as though it had been dragged through ash. "You are ready, Penelope. On Friday at Lady Danbury's ball, you will show them all what we have created." Penelope stood in the centre of the room, her skin still tingling where he had touched her. She wanted to reach out, to demand he finish the dance, but the cold mask had returned to his face.
"Yes, my lord," she said softly, clutching her reticule to her chest. As she walked out of the library, she did not see Silas sink into his chair, burying his face in his hands, and she did not know that inside her silk bag, tucked away among her dance card and her fan, lay a small leather-bound notebook, a list of names that was about to change everything. Chapter 4. The Twist. The Revenge List. The following evening, the atmosphere in the Thorne Library was no longer thick with lessons, but with a terrifying, unspoken gravity. Silas stood by the window, watching the rain turn the cobblestones of Mayfair into a dark, shimmering mirror. He had spent the afternoon in a state of restless agitation, a feeling entirely foreign to a man who prided himself on being the architect of his own emotions. He was going to tell her. He had already sent for the jeweller. He had realized that the project had become the person, and the wallflower had become the only garden he ever wished to walk in. He felt like a man who had spent his life in a windowless room, only to have Penelope Fairweather throw open the shutters and let in a blinding, beautiful light. Penelope had stepped out of the room for a moment to retrieve a book they had discussed, a rare volume of poetry. In her haste, she had left her silk reticule on the mahogany desk. It sat there, innocent and small, but as Silas moved to adjust a stray candle, his sleeve caught the drawstring. The bag slid, spilling its contents across the polished wood. A dance card, a sprig of dried lavender, and a small black leather-bound notebook.
Silas reached down to gather the items, his fingers brushing the notebook. It fell open. He intended to close it instantly. He was a gentleman, or at least a reasonable facsimile of one, but a name caught his eye. His name. At the very top of the first page, written in a neat, precise hand that did not tremble, were the words, "The Revenge List." Underneath, the first entry read, "Viscount Silas Thorne, the 1821 Almack's Assembly." Silas felt the blood drain from his face as he read the accompanying note. Comment overheard, "Why must the ton insist on parading these forgettable girls? Marrying one would be like falling asleep mid-sentence." Goal, to make him see, to make him want, to make him fall, and then to walk away while he is on his knees, to ensure the forgettable girl is the only thing he can never forget. Below his name was a list of others, Lord Percy, Lord Alfred, a dozen men who had slighted her over 3 long, lonely years, but his name was first. His name was underlined in ink so dark it looked like a scar. The library door creaked open. Penelope stepped in, a small smile playing on her lips, the book of poetry held against her chest. "I found it, Silas. I think the 3rd canto is particularly—" She stopped. The air in the room had turned to ice. Silas was standing very still, the notebook held in his hand like a smoking pistol. He looked up, and for a moment Penelope did not recognize him. The warmth she had seen growing over the past weeks was gone, replaced by a cold, jagged cruelty that made her knees weak.
"I must applaud you, Miss Fairweather," he said, his voice a low, terrifying hiss. "Truly, I have spent my life navigating the treachery of Parliament and the double dealings of the Crown, but I have never been so thoroughly outmanoeuvred by what did Percy call you? A quiet housecat." "Silas, I can explain," Penelope started, her heart plummeting. She dropped the book. It hit the floor with a dull thud. "Explain what? That this entire arrangement, the lessons, the waltzes, the lingering looks, was nothing more than a long con?" He stepped toward her, his eyes flashing with a devastating hurt that he masked with venom. "I thought I was teaching a girl how to find her confidence. I did not realize I was providing the whetstone for the blade she intended to bury in my back." "That list was written in a moment of despair," Penelope cried, stepping toward him, her hands reaching out. "It was years ago. I had forgotten it was even in there." "Do not lie to me," Silas roared, the sound echoing off the high ceilings. "I saw the way you looked at me in this room. I thought it was affection. I thought it was, God help me, I thought it was love. But it was just practice, was it not? You wanted to see if the forgettable girl could break the man who made her feel invisible." "No, Silas, please." "You have succeeded," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper that cut deeper than any shout. He threw the notebook at her feet. "I see you, Penelope. I see you clearly now. You are not a wallflower, and you are not a predator. You are simply a woman so consumed by the ghosts of her past that she is willing to burn her future just to feel a moment of spiteful triumph."
He walked toward the door, pausing only when he was level with her. He did not look at her. "The lessons are over. You wanted to be the diamond of the ton? Go, shine, ruin every man who ever looked past you, but do not ever think that I will be among them again. To me, you are once again exactly what I said 4 years ago." He turned his head, his profile sharp and unforgiving. "Forgettable." He slammed the door behind him, the sound vibrating through Penelope's very bones. She sank to the floor, clutching the black notebook to her chest, the deep purple of her gown bleeding into the shadows of the room. She had meant to ruin a villain, but she had ended up destroying the only man who had ever truly seen her soul, just as she realized she would have given up every bit of revenge just to hear him say her name once more. Chapter 5. The Queen's Gambit. The Queen's masquerade was a riot of feathered masks, gilded fans, and the sort of whispered scandal that could ruin a reputation before the first course was served. Under the glittering chandeliers of St. James's Palace, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and the underlying salt of ambition, but tonight there was only one name on every pair of lips, hidden by silk and lace: the lady in red. Penelope Fairweather did not walk into the ballroom. She arrived like a sunrise. Her gown, crafted in the daring, shimmering, blood-rose silk she had ordered in her moment of fury, clung to her curves with a scandalous precision. Her mask was a delicate filigree of gold, framing eyes that burned with a fire no one had dared to spark before. Within minutes, she was surrounded.
"Miss Fairweather, surely you remember our dance at the Somerset Ball?" Lord Percy was practically tripping over his own feet, his face flushed with a mixture of lust and desperate social climbing. He, who had once compared her to a housecat, now looked at her like a starving man eyeing a feast. "I remember a great many things, Lord Percy," Penelope said, her voice cool and melodious, carrying the weight of the lessons Silas had carved into her soul. She snapped her fan shut, the signal for utter boredom, and watched with a detached satisfaction as Percy's face fell. Men who had ignored her for 3 years were now clamouring for a moment of her time.
The wilted primrose had become the undisputed diamond of the season, a woman of such gravity that she pulled the entire room into her orbit. But as she looked at the circle of fawning suitors, Penelope realized with a sudden sharp pang that the revenge she had hungered for tasted like ash. The public adoration was hollow. The triumph was a ghost. She did not want the bumbling Percy or the dozens of rakes vying for her hand. She wanted the man who had seen her in the dark, the man who had called her forgettable and then taught her how to be immortal. She scanned the room until she saw him. Silas stood on the far balcony, away from the light, a black mask covering the upper half of his face. He looked like a fallen angel surveying a kingdom he no longer cared to rule. He was watching her, his body rigid, his gaze of physical weight against her skin. Penelope did not wait. She broke through the circle of suitors, ignoring the indignant gasps, and stepped out onto the balcony. The night air was crisp, carrying the sound of a fountain splashing in the gardens below.
Silas did not turn. "You should be inside, Penelope. Your court is waiting. I believe Lord Stirling is about to offer you his hand, and likely his soul." "I do not want his soul, Silas," she said, her voice trembling for the first time. She reached into the hidden pocket of her gown and pulled out the small black leather-bound notebook. The edges were curled from the rain of the previous night. Without a word, she walked to the edge of the stone balustrade and dropped it. It fell through the darkness, landing with a quiet splash in the center of the fountain. Silas finally turned, his eyes wide with shock. "The list was for a girl who did not know her worth," she told him, stepping into the sliver of moonlight that separated them. "It was a shield I built because I was afraid of being invisible. But I do not need it anymore, and I do not need revenge. I need you." The cynical armor Silas had worn like a shroud for a decade did not just crack, it shattered. He saw the girl who had been brave enough to walk into his library and demand a weapon, and the woman who was now brave enough to lay it down. "Penelope," he choked out, his voice thick with a vulnerability that would have shocked the ton. "I am a man of flint and shadows. I have said things to you that are unforgivable." "Then spend the rest of your life earning my forgiveness," she challenged, a small, hopeful smile touching her lips. Silas did not hesitate. He did not care about the shadows or the watchers behind the glass doors. He dropped to one knee in full view of the Queen, the gossips, and the stunned suitors. The ballroom went silent as the most feared man in London took the hand of the girl they had all forgotten. "I have spent my life looking at a room full of ghosts," Silas said, his voice ringing out across the balcony. "I did not think I was capable of love until I met the woman who refused to be a shadow. Penelope Fairweather, I do not deserve you. I am flawed, I am arrogant, and I am utterly lost without you. Will you make me the most envied man in the world? Will you marry me?" Penelope looked down at him, her heart finally full. The wallflower had not just bloomed, she had set the garden on fire. "Yes," she whispered, and as he rose to sweep her into a kiss that would be the talk of London for decades, she knew she had finally won the only game that mattered. In the end, it was not the revenge that defined Penelope Fairweather, but the courage to be seen. The woman who had once been a footnote in the ledgers of the ton became its most powerful figure, standing at the side of a man who looked at her not as a housecat, but as his equal in every war and every waltz. They lived a life of fire and truth, proving that the most beautiful things in the world are often the ones we almost missed, the ones that grow in the shadows, waiting for the right light to turn them into gold.